My name is Meredith Colson. I'm 35 years old, and I own a veterinary orthopedic surgery practice in Cedar Falls that I built from nothing after my own family made it very clear I wasn't worth investing in. 3 weeks ago, I stood in my sister Vanessa's backyard at her gender reveal party, holding a paper cup of pink lemonade, when my mother stood up in front of 40 guests and asked me to sign over my share of my grandmother's clinic property so my sister's growing family could, in her words, finally get the fresh start they deserved. Welcome back to Aereo TV, where we talk about the families who forget you until they need something from you. If you've ever been the daughter nobody invested in until suddenly you had something worth taking, this one is for you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if it feels right, hit subscribe before we go any further, because I promise you this story earns it. The backyard was strung with pastel balloons, and one of those big cardboard boxes people pop confetti out of these days. My father was manning the grill in an apron that said "World's Best Grandpa," which struck me as premature since the baby hadn't even arrived yet, but that has always been how my family operates. Certainty first, evidence later. Vanessa sat in a wicker chair someone had decorated with ribbon like a throne, one hand resting on her belly, glowing the way she always glows when a room is built around her. I had been invited exactly 4 days before the party through a group text that didn't even use my name, just, "Hey everyone, don't forget Saturday." I almost didn't go. Some old, tired part of me went anyway, the part that still hadn't fully accepted that showing up never seemed to change anything. I want you to understand that I didn't walk into that backyard suspiciously. I walked in with a gift bag and a bottle of sparkling cider because that's who I am. I keep showing up even when the invitations arrive like afterthoughts. I hugged my mother. I hugged Vanessa carefully around her belly. I told my father the ribs smelled good. For about 40 minutes, it felt almost normal, the kind of normal I used to pray for as a kid, sitting at a table where nobody was keeping score. Then my mother clinked a fork against her wine glass, the way she does when she's about to make an announcement, and something cold moved through my chest before she even opened her mouth, because I have spent 35 years learning the difference between my mother's happy voice and her getting ready to ask for something voice. She said she had a bit of family business to share while everyone was together, since it concerned all of them really, and wasn't it wonderful how family always finds a way to take care of each other? She was holding a folder, a plain manila folder, the kind you'd use for tax documents, not a baby shower. She opened it and pulled out several pages stapled at the corner, and she said that with the baby coming, and with rent going up the way it had, and with Vanessa and her husband finally ready to expand his physical therapy business into something bigger, the family had been talking, and they all agreed that Grandma's old clinic building downtown, the one I had grown up cleaning kennels in every summer, the one my grandmother had specifically talked to me about before she died, should really be put to better use for the whole family instead of just sitting there under one name. Under one name. She said it so lightly, like she was describing weather, not the fact that my grandmother's will named me the sole owner of that building 2 years before she passed. I felt 40 faces turn toward me at once, the way a room turns when everyone already knows the answer they're hoping for and is just waiting for you to catch up. My father set down his grilling tongs. Vanessa looked at me from her ribbon throne with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be one, the expression of someone who has already decided how this ends, and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to her certainty. My mother slid the folder across the picnic table toward me, right next to a bowl of pastel mints, and she said it wouldn't take but a minute, just a signature transferring my portion over so Vanessa's husband could use the building as collateral for his new clinic space. And honestly, Meredith, don't you think it's time this family did something meaningful together, instead of you always keeping things so separate? I looked down at that folder sitting there between the mints and the balloon ribbons, and I thought about every summer I spent scrubbing dog runs in that building, while Vanessa got driven to dance rehearsals, and I thought about my grandmother's voice the last time I saw her, telling me the deed tells the truth even when people don't. I didn't open the folder. I didn't sign anything. I just sat very still in that backyard full of pink and blue balloons, and I said, "Before we talk about my grandmother's building, I think you should all know exactly what happened the summer I turned 16, because that's where this story actually starts." I grew up in Cedar Falls in a narrow two-story house on Larkspur Street, the kind of town where everybody's father either worked at the plant or ran a shop downtown. My father owned Colson Hardware, third generation, and my mother kept our household running with the precision of a woman balancing a budget that never quite had enough room for two daughters to want different things. Vanessa was born 18 months before me, and from the very beginning, she was the daughter who made sense to them. She was soft-spoken in company, pretty in the way that got noticed at church potlucks, and she liked the things a daughter was supposed to like. I was the one who came home with grass stains and, more than once, something living tucked into my jacket pocket. I loved animals before I loved almost anything else. There was a stretch of woods behind our house that backed up onto a creek, and I spent whole summers down there, and somehow I always seemed to find the hurt thing before anyone else did. A bird with a broken wing, a stray dog with a limp. Once, when I was around 10, I found a raccoon caught in some wire fencing near the tree line, and instead of running for help the way any sensible child would, I knelt and tried to free it myself. It bit my hand hard enough to draw blood clean through my glove, and I remember screaming and running the whole way home, certain I was dying, certain my mother would scoop me up the way mothers do in the stories. She did take me to the emergency room, I'll give her that. But I remember sitting in the plastic chair afterwards, my hand wrapped in gauze, and hearing her on the phone with my father in the hallway, her voice pitched low but not low enough. "Do you have any idea what this visit is going to cost us?" she said. "This child and her strays." I sat there with my bandaged hand in my lap, and I understood something that took me years to fully name. My pain came with a price tag attached, and somebody was always doing the math out loud where I could hear it. Meanwhile, Vanessa's world ran on a different kind of currency entirely. She started dance lessons at 6, and by the time she was 12, there were costumes and competition fees, and a special diet plan a coach recommended that my mother followed like scripture. There were photographs of Vanessa on the mantle in sequined outfits, trophies lined up on a shelf my father built specifically for that purpose. I don't say any of this with bitterness toward her exactly, because she was a child too, and children don't choose which version of themselves gets applauded, but I do say it because you need to understand the math of that house, the way I eventually understood it. Love in my family was never distributed evenly. It was allocated, the way you'd allocate a budget, based on what the family believed would pay off. There was a Christmas when I was 13 that I still think about more than I'd like to admit. Vanessa got a full dance ensemble that year, shoes, a leotard, and a bag with her name embroidered on it, the kind of gift that took real planning and real money. I had asked, months earlier, for a proper first aid kit and maybe a book on animal rescue, because by then I already knew what I wanted to be. I opened a small box on Christmas morning and found a plastic toy stethoscope, the kind sold in the checkout aisle for $4, and my mother said, with a genuine smile on her face, "Isn't that cute, just like your little hobby?" I said thank you. I have always said thank you, even when what I meant was please see me. By the time I reached high school, the pattern had calcified into something nobody in that house even questioned anymore. When Vanessa needed extra tutoring for a class she was struggling in, there was suddenly money for a private tutor twice a week. When I asked if I could volunteer at the veterinary clinic downtown after school, my mother agreed, mostly, I think, because it was free and it got me out of the house. I never once resented the work. I loved it. I loved the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a dog's tail thumping against a metal table when it realized it was safe. What I resented, quietly, in a place I didn't let anyone see, was that nobody in my family ever asked me a single question about what I was learning there. The clinic, as it happened, belonged to my grandmother, Iris Colson, my father's mother. She had bought the building decades earlier, when veterinary care in a town like ours was still mostly a man standing in a barn with a black bag, and she leased it out to a series of practicing vets over the years, while keeping the deed firmly in her own name. She was the only person in that entire family who ever looked at me covered in dog hair and mud and said, "Now that's a girl who knows what she's for." She used to sit with me on the back steps of that clinic during my breaks, drinking bad coffee out of a thermos, and she'd ask me real questions. "What did you learn today? What surprised you? What are you going to do with all this someday?" I didn't know it then, but my grandmother had already started paying attention to something the rest of the family never once noticed, which was the difference between a daughter who was given things and a daughter who built things. She never said a word against my parents. Not once. Not in all those years. She just kept watching and kept a small, quiet ledger of her own, the kind that doesn't show up on anyone's family budget, the kind that would only reveal itself much later, long after most people would have assumed she'd forgotten all about the granddaughter who used to sit beside her with raccoon scars still faint on her hand, dreaming about a future nobody else at that table thought was worth the investment. The summer I turned 19 was the summer everything came apart, and it started with a letter that should have been the best news of my life. I had applied, without telling anyone in my family, to a competitive pre-veterinary intensive program at a university 2 states away, the kind of program that looks extraordinary on an application to vet school later and takes maybe 30 students a year out of hundreds who apply. When the acceptance letter came, it came with a partial scholarship, enough to cover most of the tuition, but not the housing, not the lab fees, not the difference that still added up to around $11,000 for the year. I remember standing in the kitchen holding that letter, my hands actually shaking, and for one bright, stupid moment, I believed this would be the thing that finally made them see me. I brought it to the dinner table that night, the way you'd bring a trophy home, and I watched my father read it slowly, his eyebrows lifting in something that almost looked like pride. My mother read it after him, and for a few seconds, I let myself believe. Then my mother set the letter down beside her plate and said, "Well, this is wonderful, honey, but you know we've already set aside the family education fund for Vanessa's wedding, since Marcus proposed in the spring, and there's the venue deposit and the dress and everything that goes with starting a marriage properly." I asked, carefully, whether there was any way to split it, whether the fund had ever actually been meant for both of us, or just for whichever one of us needed it in a given year. That was when my father set his fork down, and I remember the sound it made against the plate, small and precise, like a period at the end of a sentence he'd already decided how to finish. He said, "Your sister needed a real future, Meredith. Weddings, families, that's something solid. This program of yours is a nice idea, but it's a gamble, and we can't gamble the whole family's savings on a gamble. You'll figure something out, you always do." I sat there with that acceptance letter still warm from my own hands, and I understood, finally and completely, that the education fund had never been a fund for 2 daughters. It had always been a fund for 1 daughter, and I had simply never been told which one until the exact moment it mattered. I want to be honest about what happened over the following weeks, because it wasn't one dramatic explosion. It was a slow, methodical closing of doors. I asked about a loan co-signed by my parents, and my mother said she didn't feel right putting the family at financial risk for something so uncertain. I asked if I could take out a private loan on my own, and my father said he wasn't going to co-sign paperwork for a girl who wanted to spend her 20s elbow deep in someone's dog instead of building something stable. I remember Vanessa, during all of this, sitting at that same table talking about seating charts and flower arrangements, never once looking up, never once asking what I was going to do, as if my entire future dissolving in front of her was simply background noise to her own celebration. I took out what loans I could on my own, cobbled together a summer of double shifts at a diner, and every hour the veterinary clinic could give me, and I still came up short by nearly $4,000, 2 weeks before the program started. I asked my parents one more time, not for a gift, just for a short-term loan I promised in writing to repay, and my mother looked at me with genuine confusion on her face, as if I were asking something unreasonable, and said, Meredith, we've already explained this. Some things matter more right now. Weddings matter. Families matter. I don't think you understand how much pressure you put on us by asking again and again like this. I left that conversation, and I did the math myself, sitting on the edge of my childhood bed in the room I would never sleep in again. I had $612 in a savings account, a duffel bag, and a used Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it that I'd bought myself with diner tips 2 summers earlier. I packed that duffel bag the following morning while the house was quiet, and I left a note on the kitchen table instead of waking anyone up, because some part of me already knew that if I stood in that doorway and said goodbye out loud, someone would find a way to make me feel guilty for leaving instead of guilty for staying. I drove out of Cedar Falls with the radio off, because I didn't trust my own voice not to break if a song came on. And somewhere around the county line, I pulled into a gas station and cried in the driver's seat for exactly the length of 1 tank of gas, which felt like a fair and reasonable amount of time to grieve a family that had just told me, in every way that mattered, exactly what I was worth to them. Then I wiped my face, bought a coffee I couldn't really afford, and made myself a promise in that parking lot that I have kept every single day since. I would build something of my own, something so solid and so entirely mine that no family meeting, no folder passed across a table, no vote of who mattered more would ever be able to take it from me again. I didn't know yet how long that would take, or what it would cost me, or that the person who would eventually hand me the tools to keep that promise was already quietly watching from a back porch 2 states away, keeping a ledger nobody else in my family had bothered to notice existed. I want to tell you about my grandmother Iris now, because everything that happened later only makes sense once you understand who she actually was, not the soft background figure my parents treated her as, but a woman who spent the last years of her life quietly building something for me, while everyone else assumed she had simply forgotten I existed. She called me 2 weeks after I left Cedar Falls, and I almost didn't answer because I assumed it was my mother again, calling to tell me how much stress I'd caused everyone. It wasn't. It was Grandma Iris, and the first thing she said, before hello, before are you safe, was, well, it's about time somebody in this family did something brave. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't ask me to apologize. She asked how much I still needed to make that program work, and when I told her, embarrassed, staring at the ceiling of the cheap motel room I was staying in that week, she said, "Give me your account number, and don't you dare tell your parents where this came from." That was the beginning of something I never spoke about to anyone in my family for years. A quiet envelope that showed up every few months, sometimes cash tucked into a birthday card 2 months early, sometimes a direct deposit with a memo line that just said groceries, as if either of us actually believed that word. She funded the difference that year, and the year after that, and every year of vet school after that, one careful envelope at a time, and she never once let me thank her properly, because thanking her, she said, would make it a transaction, and this was never a transaction to her. She visited me twice during those years, both times without telling my parents she was going, driving 4 hours alone in a car that was older than my Civic, showing up at my apartment with a casserole dish and a list of questions about my coursework that actually meant something, not performed interest, but the real thing. She sat on the edge of a second-hand couch I'd bought at a church sale and asked me to explain a surgical technique I was learning, and she listened to the entire explanation, nodding, asking follow-up questions, the way you'd listen to someone you genuinely believed was going somewhere. I realize now that those visits were the only time in my entire life anyone in that family had ever simply sat and been curious about me without an agenda attached. She told me stories on those visits too, the kind older women tell when they've decided it's finally time to pass something down. She told me about the year she bought that clinic building downtown, back when the bank had laughed at a woman coming in alone to ask for a commercial loan, and how she'd gone to 3 different banks before one finally took her seriously, and how she'd sworn to herself that day that she would never again let someone else's low opinion of her decide what she was capable of building. She told me that story more than once over the years, always at slightly different moments, and it took me a long time to understand she wasn't just reminiscing, she was teaching me something, laying a foundation one visit at a time for a lesson she knew I would need eventually. The last time I saw her healthy, she said something on that back porch of hers that I didn't fully understand until much later. We were sitting with our coffee the way we used to when I was a teenager scrubbing kennels, except now I was a licensed veterinarian building my own surgical specialty, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "The deed tells the truth even when people don't, Meredith. Paper doesn't play favorites the way people do." I asked her what she meant by that, and she just smiled and changed the subject to asking whether I'd met anyone worth bringing home, which was her way of ending a conversation she wasn't ready to finish yet. She passed away 18 months later, quietly, in her sleep, the kind of death people describe as peaceful, because it spares them from imagining it any other way. I flew back for the funeral, and I want to be honest with you about what that funeral looked like, because it matters for everything that came after. My parents were there, of course, and Vanessa was there with her husband Marcus, but the whole event felt rushed on their end, punctuated by whispered conversations about how they needed to get back for something related to Vanessa's baby shower planning, as if my grandmother's burial were an inconvenient stop on the way to a party. I stood at that graveside in the cold, and I found myself, not for the first time, being the only person in that family who seemed to actually understand what we were losing. A week after the funeral, a lawyer named Harold Bett called me and asked me to come into his office alone, which struck me as strange until he explained that my grandmother had left very specific instructions about how her affairs were to be handled, instructions that included a locked wooden box addressed to me by name and a note in her own handwriting that said, "Read everything before you believe anyone, especially the people who love you the most." I sat in that lawyer's office holding a small brass key, and some part of me already understood, the way you understand weather changing before the first drop of rain actually falls, that whatever was inside that box was going to reshape everything I thought I knew about my family, and about exactly how much my grandmother had seen coming long before any of us did. I want to tell you what was actually in that box, because I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Harold Bett's office for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to open it. The way you hesitate before opening a door you already suspect leads somewhere important. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was the original deed to the clinic building downtown, the one my grandmother had fought 3 banks to buy decades earlier, and beneath that, a copy of her will, notarized and witnessed, dated a full 2 years before her death, naming me as the sole owner of that property. Full stop, no conditions, no shared arrangement with my father or my sister. Underneath the will was a stack of bank statements going back years, her own careful handwriting in the margins, tracking the envelopes she'd sent me during vet school, and beneath all of that, a single handwritten letter that I have read so many times since that I could probably recite it from memory. She wrote that she had watched my parents make their choices for years, and that she had chosen, quietly and without confrontation, to make a different set of choices of her own. She wrote that she had seen the raccoon bite, and the toy stethoscope, and the education fund that was never really meant for 2 daughters, and that she had decided a long time ago that paper would say what nobody in that family had ever been brave enough to say out loud. "The building is yours, Meredith," she wrote. "Not because you're better than your sister, but because you're the one who never once asked what something was worth before deciding whether it deserved your care. Use it, build on it, and if anyone in this family ever tries to tell you it should belong to someone else, you show them this letter, and you let the truth do the talking, because I never could." I sat with that letter for a long time before I told anyone, and I want to be clear that for the first several weeks after the funeral, I didn't do anything with it at all. I simply kept building the life I was already building, expanding my surgical practice, saving toward the orthopedic specialty equipment I'd been dreaming about for years, and I assumed, foolishly maybe, that my grandmother's wishes would simply be respected, because they were written down clearly by a woman who had every legal right to leave her own property to whomever she chose. I had no idea, sitting in that quiet stretch of normal life, that back in Cedar Falls, my father had already begun having conversations with a real estate attorney about what he called clarifying the family's interest in that building, conversations that had started, as it happened, almost immediately after the funeral. The first sign that something was wrong came through a service I'd signed up for, on the advice of a colleague who worked in property law. A simple free alert through the county recorder's office that notifies you the instant anything gets filed against a piece of property in your name. I'd set it up almost as an afterthought when I inherited the building, the way you'd set up a smoke detector you never expect to actually go off. 8 months after my grandmother's death, it went off. I remember exactly where I was standing when the email came through, in my kitchen holding a mug of coffee, and the subject line read simply, "New document recorded against your monitored property." I opened it with the kind of dread you feel when you already suspect the answer before you look. A quitclaim-style transfer had been filed with the county, moving a substantial interest in the clinic building from my name to my father's, dated only 3 weeks earlier, bearing a signature that was supposed to be mine. I stared at that email for a long time, and then I did the only thing that made sense to a woman who had built an entire career on precision and evidence. I called a property attorney named Denise Farrow, and I told her everything. The letter, the deed, the alert, and she asked me to come in with copies of every document I had. Denise confirmed within a week what I had already suspected in my gut. The signature on that filed transfer was not mine, not close enough to fool anyone who actually knew my handwriting, and the notary attached to it was someone I had never met in my life, operating out of a town I had never once set foot in. Denise explained to me, gently but clearly, that this kind of fraud happens far more often within families than most people would ever believe, that the county recorder's office simply files whatever is handed across the counter without verifying signatures, and that the only reason I had caught it at all was the alert I'd set up almost by accident. She also told me something that settled cold in my chest and stayed there. Whoever forged that transfer would eventually need to act on it, to prove possession, to actually use the building for whatever they were planning, and that when they did, we would be ready and waiting with everything we needed to prove exactly what they had done, in front of whoever was watching. Denise gave me the same advice a good lawyer always gives in a moment like this, which is that knowing something and proving something are two very different animals, and that the worst thing I could do was call my father screaming about a forged document before he'd actually shown his hand in a way the law could recognize. A forged deed sitting quietly in a county filing cabinet is a crime on paper, she told me, but a forged deed someone actually tries to use, to sell, to borrow against, to physically occupy, that becomes a crime, with a face attached to it, one a prosecutor can actually work with. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my adult life, which was nothing at all, at least on the surface, while underneath I was building a case as carefully as I would plan a surgery, one document, one confirmation, one quiet phone call at a time. Over the following weeks, I started noticing things I would have missed if I hadn't already known what to look for. My mother began calling more often, her voice warm, in a way it hadn't been warm with me in over 15 years, asking how the practice was doing, whether I was seeing anyone, whether I'd thought about coming home for a visit soon. Vanessa texted me for the first time in nearly a year, a casual message about how exciting it was that Marcus was finally ready to expand his physical therapy business into something bigger, and wasn't it wonderful how family could come together to make big dreams happen. I read that message twice, sitting at my kitchen table, and I understood immediately what she was fishing for, whether I already knew, whether the forged transfer had gone through cleanly, whether the ground beneath their plan was as solid as they were hoping. I played along the way. You play along with a patient's owner who insists their dog definitely didn't get into anything it shouldn't have. Gently, patiently, gathering the real information without ever raising your voice or tipping your hand. I told my mother the practice was doing well. I told Vanessa that was wonderful news about Marcus, and I asked, casually, what kind of space he was looking at for the expansion, and she mentioned, just as casually, that they'd actually found the perfect spot already, downtown, a building that had been sitting mostly idle for years that just needed some updates. I set my phone down after that conversation and sat very still in my own kitchen for a long time, because I now had, in her own words, confirmation of exactly what they intended to do with a building that had never legally belonged to any of them. Denise and I built the file methodically over the following month. We obtained a certified copy of the fraudulent transfer from the county recorder, the forged signature clear enough under close comparison that even someone untrained could see the slant was wrong, the loop on my own initial nothing like the way I actually write it. We confirmed my grandmother's original will was still valid and properly filed, naming me as sole heir with no ambiguity whatsoever. We pulled the notary's registration and discovered, unsurprisingly, that the name attached to the forged document didn't correspond to any licensed notary currently active in the state, which meant the whole thing had been fabricated from top to bottom by someone who assumed, correctly for a while, that nobody would ever check that closely. I also started saving everything, the way I have learned you must in situations like this, screenshotting every text from Vanessa, noting every phone call from my mother with the date and time, building a quiet folder on my phone, the same way I once built a case file for a difficult surgical diagnosis, evidence stacked carefully in order, waiting for the moment it would actually matter. Denise warned me repeatedly not to confront them yet, not to let a single flicker of what I knew show through in my voice on those calls, because the entire plan depended on them believing I had no idea what they'd done, believing the path was still clear for them to finish what they'd started. The invitation to the gender reveal party came exactly 4 days before the event, through that same impersonal group text, and I remember staring at my phone for a long moment before deciding to go. Denise had actually encouraged it once I told her about it, pointing out that people like my father and mother rarely stay patient once they believe they've already won, that if they were planning to make some kind of move, a family gathering with witnesses present was exactly the kind of stage they'd choose, because they had spent my entire life mistaking a room full of relatives for a courtroom that would always rule in their favor. I packed that sparkling cider and that gift bag, knowing exactly what I was walking into, carrying nothing on the surface but a folded napkin's worth of composure, and underneath it, in a folder on my phone and copies in my car, everything I would eventually need to make sure that the next time my mother slid a piece of paper across a table toward me, it would be the very last time anyone in that family ever mistook my silence for surrender. So there I was, back in that backyard full of pastel balloons, my mother's manila folder sitting on the picnic table, between a bowl of mints and a stack of paper plates, 40 faces turned toward me, waiting for me to pick up a pen and sign away the one thing my grandmother had specifically built for me to keep. I did not reach for the folder. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder of my own, plain and unremarkable, the kind nobody would look twice at in a stack of baby shower favors, and I set it down gently beside hers, the way you set something down when you already know it's going to change the temperature of the entire room. I asked my mother calmly whether she remembered the summer I was 16 and got bitten by a raccoon trying to save it, and whether she remembered what she said to my father in that hospital hallway about the cost of my strays. Her face did something complicated, somewhere between confusion and the beginning of alarm, because she had clearly expected tears or an argument, not a woman opening a folder with the same steady hands she uses in surgery. I told the whole backyard, gently but clearly, about the education fund that was never actually meant for 2 daughters, about the acceptance letter I brought home with such hope, about my father telling me I would figure something out because I always do. A few relatives shifted in their lawn chairs. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years set down her drink. Then I opened my folder and laid out, 1 page at a time, exactly what my grandmother had left behind. Her original will, notarized, dated 2 full years before her death, naming me as sole owner of the clinic building with no conditions attached whatsoever. Beside it, The fraudulent quitclaim transfer filed against that same property 8 months after her funeral, a signature on it that was never mine, alongside the confirmation from the county that the attached notary didn't exist anywhere in the state's records. I set down the email from the property fraud alert last, the one that had first tipped me off, and I said, quietly, that I had known about all of this for weeks now, and that I had simply been waiting to see who would finally say the quiet part out loud in front of everyone who mattered. My father's face went the color of the paper plates stacked beside him. Vanessa's hand had gone still on top of her belly, her mouth slightly open, the ribbon throne suddenly looking exactly like what it always was, a wicker chair someone had decorated to make an ordinary woman feel like a queen. My mother reached for the forged document, as she could somehow make it disappear by touching it, and I told her gently that I wouldn't recommend handling it any further, since it was already documented, photographed, and sitting with my attorney, and that the notary registration alone was enough to interest the district attorney's office, whether or not anyone in this backyard wanted it to. That was when Marcus, standing near the grill, made the mistake of speaking first, saying something about how this was clearly just a misunderstanding, that surely the family could sort it out privately, without lawyers getting involved. And I looked at him and said that a misunderstanding doesn't require a forged signature and a notary who has never existed, and that if he was hoping to expand his business using a building he had no legal claim to, he might want to speak with his own attorney very soon, because I certainly wasn't planning to let this quietly go away. My mother finally found her voice, and it came out exactly the way I expected it to, wounded and indignant, insisting that everything they had done was for the family, that surely I understood how much pressure Vanessa and Marcus were under with the baby coming, that family was supposed to help family. I let her finish. Then I said the thing I had been carrying inside me since I was 16 years old, holding a bandaged hand in a plastic chair, listening to her calculate what my pain was worth in dollars. "You didn't lose a daughter when I left this family," I told her, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You just finally admitted, out loud, in front of everyone, that you never wanted the one who couldn't be improved." The backyard went completely silent, except for the sound of somebody's toddler, laughing at nothing in particular near the fence. My Aunt Carol, the one who had set down her drink earlier, stood up slowly and said she thought it was probably time she headed home, and something about the way she said it, flat and final, told me she had just quietly changed her mind about which side of this family she wanted to be standing on. I gathered my folder back together, page by careful page, and I looked at my father one last time, the man who had told a 19-year-old girl she would figure something out, because she always does. I said, "I did figure it out, Dad. I just never imagined it would be you I had to figure it out against." I left that backyard without raising my voice, and without slamming a single door, and I want you to understand that walking away calmly was harder than any shouting match could ever have been, because every instinct I'd carried since childhood wanted to soften the moment, to make it easier on them the way I always had. I didn't. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and let the silence in that car be exactly what it needed to be, the sound of 35 years finally settling into place. Denise filed a notice of fraudulent transfer with the county the following week, and because the evidence was so thoroughly documented, the forged signature, the non-existent notary, the timeline lining up so cleanly with my father's own conversations about clarifying the family's interest, a judge voided the transfer within a matter of weeks. The clinic building was legally, cleanly, unquestionably mine again, exactly as it had always been on paper, exactly as my grandmother intended. Denise also referred the forged notary registration to the district attorney's office, and though my father was never formally charged, the investigation made its way through the county in the way these things do in a small town. Quietly, but not quietly enough. People talk. People always talk. Marcus's expansion plans, as it turned out, had been entirely contingent on using that building as collateral, and without it, the financing fell apart within a month. I heard through Carol, of all people, who had become an unexpected ally in the aftermath, that the physical therapy business Marcus had been so certain about never materialized in the form he'd imagined, and that the strain of it had put a noticeable distance between him and Vanessa that hadn't been there before the baby shower. I take no pleasure in that. Not really, though I won't pretend there wasn't a certain grim clarity in watching a plan built on stolen ground collapse the way stolen ground always eventually does. My mother has not spoken to me since that afternoon. Not one phone call, not one message, and I have made my peace with that in a way I genuinely did not expect to. My father sent a single letter about 4 months later, and I still have not decided whether I will answer it. He wrote that he understood why I did what I did, that he wasn't asking for forgiveness so much as acknowledgement, and that some nights he thought about the toy stethoscope he let my mother buy me that Christmas, and wondered what would have happened if he'd said something different at the table. I read it once, folded it carefully, and put it in the same drawer where I keep my grandmother's letter, not because I've forgiven him, but because I'm not ready to throw away the possibility that people can eventually tell the truth about themselves, even years too late. Vanessa reached out once, a single text about 8 months after the baby was born, a photo of the baby with no caption at all, just the image, sent late at night. I didn't respond right away. I sat with it for 2 days before I sent back 3 words. He's beautiful, congratulations, because some doors you don't have to slam shut forever. You can simply leave them open a crack and let the other person decide whether they're brave enough to walk through it properly someday. As for the clinic building, I expanded my orthopedic surgical practice into it myself the following spring, gutting the old space and rebuilding it into something my grandmother would have recognized instantly. Not because it looked the same, but because it finally served the purpose she'd always seen for it. A place where the person who showed up and did the work got to keep what she built. I had a small brass plaque installed near the front entrance, nothing showy, just her name and the words she used to say to me on that back porch. The deed tells the truth even when people don't. Underneath my own name on the practice paperwork now, in fine print nobody but me really notices, there's a scholarship fund I started for veterinary students who don't have family money behind them, funded quietly, envelope by envelope, exactly the way she once funded me. Here is what I have learned, and I hope it lands somewhere true for you tonight. Family was never supposed to be a ledger where love gets allocated based on what you're worth to somebody else's plans. The people who are truly yours are the ones who show up without doing that math out loud where you can hear it. The ones who hand you tools instead of price tags. If you have ever been the daughter, the son, the sibling who was told to figure it out because you always do, I want you to hear me clearly. You are allowed to build something so entirely your own that nobody ever gets to vote on whether you deserve to keep it. If this story meant something to you tonight, tell me in the comments who your grandmother Iris was, the one person who saw you clearly when nobody else bothered to look. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because there is always another family, another folder, another quiet truth waiting to be set down on the table.